There is no one I would rather talk to about the sad anniversary of the October 7th attacks against Israel by Hamas and what has transpired in the 12 months since than New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. Tom, thank you for speaking with us for a little bit today. I'm so grateful. You have such expertise in the region. I want to ask you a question that reporters aren't supposed to ask, really, but how are you feeling as we mark this 1 year anniversary?
Well, first of all, Katie, it's great to be with you, and I'm so glad we could do this. I'm super depressed, frankly. I've been writing about this war, obviously, for a year since it began, but been writing about this drama, since I was 15, and I'm now 71. So I've seen all the lows, then the highs of the Oslo peace agreement, Camp David, and now the super lows that we're not only back to the beginning of the conflict at just the most primordial way, a kind of shepherd's war, but we're back there with precision rockets. We're back there with much more lethal weapons. It's as if the devil himself decided that he wanted to burn up every last shred of hope for Israeli-Palestinian peace. And he summoned kind of the worst of the worst actors from the whole region to create a giant bonfire. And we're trying to quell it to see if we can save any of the embers and out of that rebuild our way back to some kind of Palestinian-Israeli understanding of two states for two people.
That seems increasingly unlikely, Tom. As you said, you're very depressed. And in fact, you've called this the most dangerous time in the modern Middle East. You've been covering, as you mentioned, this region since you were 15 years old. What is it, other than, say, precision weapons and the bad actors who are involved from all sides, that makes this the most dangerous time?
Well, it really is that, Katie, that we for the first time between Israel and Hezbollah, for instance, we saw something we'd never seen before. Mutual assured destruction between a non-state actor and a state actor, Hezbollah being the non-state actor, armed with long-range precision weapons, and Israel being a state actor armed with long-range precision weapons. Now, the reason Israel for a year was not ready to take on Hezbollah was precisely because there was this sense of mutual assured destruction. It turned out Israel acted first and was able to largely, but not entirely, destroy a lot of Hezbollah's long-range capabilities. But it's been firing rockets into Haifa almost every day. Israel's anti-missile shield has intercepted most of them. But over and above that, you have another threat now of an Iran-Israel war with long-range missiles, missiles that can if they hit any target, a civilian one or a military one, can cause tremendous damage. And so, mutual assured destruction really is on the table now in a very vivid way. And we've even had, examples of it. This isn't just theoretical. And it comes at a time, though, Katie, also when America, the most important referee in this conflict, is tired of the Middle East. We've wanted to pivot away from the region since the Obama administration. We have one candidate, Donald Trump, who's running on a kind of neo-isolationist strategy. And everyone's just kind of tired of it, And so the ability to summon the energy to kind of referee this thing and divide the parties, in some stable way, has really been diminished.
Tom, can you talk about the dangers of Middle Eastern fatigue for the United States and why the U.S. needs to stay engaged with what's happening in the region?
Well, we have a very vivid example that we're on the eve of right now, which is that Israel is threatening to retaliate with missiles and fighter jets against Iran for its recent missile strike against Israel, which was in response to an Israeli assassination of a pro-Iranian leader in Lebanon, which was in response to that militia's missile strikes against Israel. So, but what have the Iranians been saying? Listen to what they've been saying, Katie, just in the last 24 hours. They've been saying, hey, United States, hey, Israel, if Israel attacks our oil facilities or attacks us, period, we may attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE and attack their oil facilities. So you won't just be dealing with the world short of Iranian oil, which mostly affects China. You could be dealing with the world short of Saudi or UAE oil. So don't think that this is just going to be confined to us. So that's a very real danger in general to the global economy. It's a very
What
real,
would that mean, Tom?
yeah, it would mean much higher oil prices in the short term, a radical spike in oil prices, and politically for the Biden administration and Kamala Harris's run for the White House, it would be extremely ill-timed to see a spike in oil prices on the eve of the election when your opponent, Donald Trump, is basically saying we're fighting too many wars. We shouldn't be involved in those parts of the world. Vote for me, and this will never happen.
Let's talk about the future, the near future. How do you see a Harris administration differing from a Trump administration in terms of how they might deal with the Middle East and the ramifications for each approach?
So, Katie, I don't know because I'm pretty sure they don't know. They don't know because they haven't been able to think either of them really deeply about this. Neither has a sort of full-fledged team of their own right now. Obviously, Vice President Harris has been part of the administration's team, and the situation is so much in flux. All I can tell you is what I hope for, whether it's Harris or Trump. It's time for a U.S. plan. We have been, to put it in economic terms, uh, price takers here, but not price makers. We need to be putting down a plan for a two-state solution, for a resolution of the Israel-Lebanon conflict, and offering to put real muscle, even I would say US and NATO troops on the ground to make it happen. But right now, we just have a very unstable situation of Israel and Iran getting closer and closer to a missile war. Israel now having invaded southern Lebanon, the war in Gaza going on, and nobody, and I mean nobody, has a plan for the morning after. And that's just a prescription for more fighting and a more and more dangerous conflict.
Why hasn't, in your view, or has the Biden administration been engaged enough in the last 12 months? I know that Joe Biden just had his first conversation in 2 months with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Wednesday. How would you grade how the Biden administration has handled this?
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for them only because it's super complicated. Israel was attacked in a horrific way on October 7th, and the Biden administration's view was it had a right to respond. It had a moral and strategic right to respond. How it responded, though, is a whole nother question in two ways, Katie. One is how it responded militarily, whether that was the right approach. My own argument was it should have done it more like Munich and less like Dresden. Munich, I mean, after the Munich massacre, very targeted.
And
Let's
perhaps learns a little bit about our response to 9/11 in
right.
Afghanistan.
And just rushing off and doing that, that didn't end real well. But also, what kind of political context do you retaliate in if you're Israel, or do you respond in? Do you, as Israel has done, essentially invade Gaza, take over Gaza with absolutely no plan for the morning after and no Palestinian partner? Or do you make clear that you've come into Gaza to dismantle Hamas, to enable the Palestinian Authority that has accepted the Oslo Peace Accords to replace Hamas there and be a partner for the long term for a two-state solution? That's a totally different approach. And I thought the administration should have done much more to insist on that. It's complicated by two things. One is, a lot of people say, well, what leverage do we have? Well, the leverage we have is we can cut off their arms. But Israel is in the middle of a super dangerous neighborhood. And you cut off arms to Israel, and believe me, Hezbollah and Iran notice. And at the same time, we're on the eve of an election. And the administration doesn't want to do anything to alienate either Arab American voters in Michigan or Jewish American voters in big urban areas from Los Angeles to New York City. And so because of that, they've been kind of stuck in this very passive, mumbling way. All these stories about Biden calling Netanyahu an SOB, and I'm sure they're all true, and probably some even saltier language. But they've been kind of paralyzed.
I was going to say, if there wasn't an election taking place, do you think that the US would have acted quite differently?
Yes, I do. I think we would have acted differently, been much more aggressive and willing to put out our own vision of a morning after and push toward it. Now, what will Trump do? That's a complete wild card. On the one hand, he comes with an isolationist instinct, which he's been articulating and reinforcing every day. But on the other hand, Donald Trump is the only American president who, since Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, I guess you could say, but he's the only one in recent memory who's put his own peace plan on the table, a plan for two states for two people, the Trump peace plan. And it's not the plan I would have put down or my cup of tea at all, but it is a peace plan. And by putting it down, he actually forced the Abraham Accords. So what Trump is saying now on the campaign stump and what he would actually do as president, he doesn't know. I don't know. Nobody knows.
I don't want to frighten people, but other than an increase in oil prices and feeling the pain at the pump, Tom, what could an even wider war? I'm assuming you think we're in this wider war already,
Yes.
but what could an even wider war portend for the rest of the world, in addition to higher gas prices? I mean, it's much more serious than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, a wider war. We've already seen Iran has attacked Israel twice now with missile volleys of over 100 missiles each. The only reason those did limited damage to Israel was because of deep collaboration between the United States and Israel and a few other allies, Great Britain, France, and some Arab allies. Um, Now imagine, though, that Israel attacks an Iranian nuclear facility or
Which I guess has been discussed, right?
has definitely been discussed. And then Iran, sends Iran has thousands and thousands of missiles. They can send 500 at a time, basically, and Israel can't intercept them all. Then the United States may have to get involved on Israel's behalf. And so we're sitting here having this really calm conversation, on a Friday morning, and I hope it remains calm, but things could get really crazy here really fast.
So, what should all the parties involved be doing? I mean, obviously, Netanyahu, it's in his interests, according to many observers, to continue the war. His popularity has grown since Israel started attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. The United States is worried about the election, which is less than a month away. Then you have all the surrounding Arab nations. I mean, if you, in the best case scenario, Tom, what would happen to mitigate this really terrifying, potentially lethal outcome?
Well, I think the best thing would be in a U.S. diplomatic initiative that says to Israel, we want you to get out of South Lebanon as soon as you can negotiate a border arrangement with the Lebanese government that demarcates the border. And when you leave, the U.S. will organize a NATO force, not a UN force, but a NATO force to occupy that area from the Litani River in Lebanon south to the Israeli border and ensure that no hostile force gets in there that can ruin the lives of South Lebanese, and so they can go back to their homes and villages, and Israelis can go back to their homes and villages in kibbutzim in the north of Israel. And it's going to be a lethal force that no one is going to mess with under the legitimacy of the Lebanese army. Okay, that's the option there. And I would be doing the same thing essentially in Gaza, um, uh, uh, basically restoring the Oslo framework to Gaza, creating an Area A in Gaza that would be controlled entirely by the Palestinian Authority, Area B that would be a Palestinian Authority civilian control, but Israeli military control around the perimeter for a limited period of time, with the understanding that over the long term, that Israeli force would be replaced by an American-led or directed or supplied or funded military force. The point is, Katie, we can no longer solve this problem at the old level of waiting for the sides there to negotiate with each other. There is simply all trust has been shattered. And I believe personally, we're not going to get anywhere unless a trusted third party, and there's only one of those in the zoo, it's called the United States of America, leads an international force that secures Israel's northern border and border with Gaza, but it has to be done in the context of an Israeli government that is committed to a two-state solution. We are not going to make Israel safe for crazy messianic Jewish settlers in the West Bank.
But having said that, I mean, Netanyahu, it doesn't seem like he's going anywhere anytime soon. So if this arrangement is predicated on a different leader, that doesn't seem likely at this point, does it, Tom?
It doesn't have to be a different leader, but he's going to have a, if you'll pardon the mixed metaphor, come to Jesus
I
conversation
was going to say,
with us and his own people, because we're just not doing this anymore. And so we need to have a very tough conversation with him. We are not here to make the world safe for your crazy ass coalition. And that's what I mean by an American initiative.
but do you think this is likely to happen? You also mentioned the UN. Um, so can this come together and how quickly? Because it seems to me that time is really of the essence here.
Well, again, we have this little problem of our election and then a transition, and the timing all couldn't be worse. It's not going to come together just like that, but it's certainly not going to come together unless you take the first step. And the first step is an American plan, and committing real American power behind it, and speaking very clearly to both sides or to all sides, Lebanese, the Iranians, Israel, and Palestinians. If you think you're tired of this, Katie, imagine how tired of it I am. And so I'd prefer to be golfing with your husband and not dealing with the Persian Gulf. But this is what I'm stuck with. I think Americans are fed up with it. And we have reached a point where if we don't go down this road, it's not going to be a one-state solution. It's not going to be, it's going to be a no-state solution for two people because they're just going to kill each other. It's going to be a forever war. And I think we have to come to terms with that, and they have to come to terms with that.
I can't think of a time where US leadership has been more important. Um, I know you said that the Biden administration has been concerned about the election and possibly been paralyzed, in fact, by it. But it's very disappointing that the US has not shown more muscle in this whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my cup of tea. I think Joe Biden's been a great president in many ways on foreign policy, but he complains about Netanyahu privately. I'm sure he calls him all sorts of names privately, but we should be talking directly to the Israeli public and not having it mediated through Netanyahu and his spinmeisters. It's what I do in my column. I'm free to do that because I'm not, I'm a columnist. I'm not in the government. But to me, that's what has to be done. And otherwise, again, the alternative is not going to be a one-state solution. It's not going to be some ceasefire. It's going to be a forever war with more and more lethal weapons. And we will end up with no states for two people.
I feel like you, more than any other American journalist, has your finger on the pulse of the mood and mindset of the Israeli people. Can they be, as you said, speaking directly to them, could they be better partners for some kind of plan than the government itself? And how do we tap into that effectively?
Yeah, obviously you probably have to have a change in government there, and that has to come through Israeli politicians, through an opposition emerging, through an opposition persuading a majority of Israelis to do this. Very difficult, super difficult while the war is going on, and Israeli hostages are being held in Gaza still because Israelis can't think straight under those conditions. We do need a ceasefire. We do need a hostage release and a prisoner swap, whatever Hamas is demanding. We need to get that war over with. I think only then will Israelis step back and reassess the situation. That happened after the 1973 war. Remember, people thought that was the worst possible war. We'll never trust Egypt again. And then after the war, people said, you know what, we better figure this out. After the first Intifada, people said, peace with the Palestinians? Are you kidding? And suddenly Rabin and Arafat were shaking hands on the White House lawn. There is no other way. Now, the Oslo, the Egyptian-Israeli deal worked. Camp David is held to this day. Oslo fell apart for a lot of reasons. Hopefully, we've learned from that lesson. Hopefully, and tragically, people have looked into the abyss this devil's bonfire that I described at the beginning, and we'll realize that we just can't do this. But I make no predictions. It's this war has no name up to now, but my name for it is the worst of the worst, the war of the worst, because you basically have a war now being driven by the worst of the worst on all sides. It started with the worst of the worst of the Palestinians, Yahya Sinwar, psychopath in the military wing of Hamas, um, being then driven on the Israeli side by the messianic wing of a crazy cabinet in Netanyahu government, and the worst of the worst in Lebanon, the Hezbollah militia, and the worst of the worst in the region, Iran. So it's the war of the worst.
I wanted to just ask you about the future of Hamas, Tom, because you mentioned a two-state solution or some kind of political solution where the Palestinian Authority would take over Gaza. And of course, they're the ruling power in the West Bank for the Palestinians, but not for Gaza. What would happen to Hamas? And I'm curious, obviously, it's been eroded, its power, and a lot of its leaders killed. But I heard Jay Johnson the other day, former Secretary of Homeland Security, say for every member of Hamas you kill, two are born.
Yeah, it's more complicated than that, I'd say, but it's the way I look at it is like this, Katie. My view is Israel should just put a deal on the table, give us our hostages back, and get out of Gaza. They've already badly damaged Hamas. They now control the perimeter. Hamas can't get new weapons in the way it did in the past. I'd actually like Sinwar, the Hamas leader, to come out of his tunnel and actually have a press conference. And I actually would like to sit in the first row and be able to ask the first question. And the first question would be, Mr. Sinwar, you won. You got Israel to withdraw from Gaza and enter into a permanent ceasefire. You won. You won. I just have one question for you. Where were you on October 6th? What did you have on October 6th? You had a permanent ceasefire with Israel and no Israeli troops in Gaza. So you just fought a war for over a year to get back to exactly where you were on October 6th, only with 42,000 plus of your people dead and about 80% of the housing stock in Gaza destroyed. Wonderful victory. So sooner or later, the logic of that, I think, would actually be what pulls him down. The only way you destroy Hamas is if Palestinians reject it. And trying to play whack-a-mole with every last Hamas, leader is not the way to do it. I want Sinwar to have to face his people and explain to them why he fought this war and what the great victory was that cost 42,000 Palestinian lives, probably 100,000 wounded, the housing stock in Gaza destroyed. I think that's what brings Sinwar down, not another Israeli bomb.
I've always wondered, Tom, about the public opinion in Gaza towards Hamas, which is very hard to determine. But now that I have you, how does the average Palestinian feel about Hamas? I mean, it's all many of them, because a lot of them, the population is young, under the age of 18. It's what it's all they've ever known. So I'm curious if you think there could be a an uprising, if you will, a nonviolent uprising against the Hamas leadership.
Again, the polling is very difficult to understand, but you have to remember, Katie, before the war in 2019 and 2021, there were uprising against Hamas in Gaza. It was called in Arabic, Bidna Naish. We want to live. Think of that as the title of an uprising. That's what Gazans were saying to Hamas. You're joking us, okay? We want to live. And so I have no doubt about two things. One, that uprising would emerge after Israel got out, if Hamas restored control, and Hamas would do everything it could to kill it. But these guys are just like the Iranian regime. They're not like Mubarak's Egypt, where the leader said, you know what, I'm just not going to kill all my people. I will step down. No, these guys will kill as many people as they can. That's a fight Palestinians will have to have. But I do believe in the end, it's one where Hamas will lose. And but it will be delegitimized and can only be delegitimized by its own people, but only if those people feel that they have an alternative with Israel and aren't just doing Israel's bidding.
I guess I've always wondered why there isn't a saner person or leadership structure that could replace Hamas. Is that just impossible given the current situation? Are people too frightened? I don't understand why the Palestinians don't have an alternative,
Well,
Tom.
they did have an alternative. It was the Palestinian Authority, which was corrupt, incredibly incompetent, and run by nincompoops, which is why there was an election, back in, what was it, 2007, 2005, I forget which one, and Hamas won the election. And it was
But there
basically,
hasn't been an election since.
oh, but and then a protest vote, and then again it was one vote, one man, one vote, one time, and ever since then there's been no election in the West Bank or in Gaza. That's why any return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza has to begin with a complete reform of the Palestinian Authority, installation of a new prime minister, a Salam Fayyad, the actually the most effective and powerful and non-corrupt Palestinian leader the West Bank has ever seen, was pushed out because he was effective and non-corrupt. And you have to have a new PA. They've got to get their act together too. Palestinians have agency also, and they need to produce the leadership that they need and say that they want. And if they can't, then no one can help them.
Before we go, I want to ask you just one more question, Tom, about the situation in the US, because we've seen a real chasm in the Democratic Party, certainly a generational divide in how Americans are viewing this whole conflict, with younger people, as you well know, being much more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I'm curious how you have observed this chasm and what it might mean, not only for the election, but sort of the US relationship with all the countries in the Middle East, and particularly Israel.
So, I have a saying, Katie, which is I love Israelis and Palestinians, but God save me from their American friends. They drive me nuts. Okay. Whether I'm talking about APAC in Congress or all these student protests on college campuses, I just have one message to both of them. You all have one job. You just have one job, very simple job. Support the moderate forces on the ground on both sides. That's your only job, okay? Now, if you're not ready to do that, if all you want to do is throw logs on the fire from your side, you are absolutely making things worse, not better. You have one job. And if you have a chant, like from the river to the sea, that takes you 15 minutes to explain why it doesn't mean what it obviously means, maybe you ought to get a different chant. Let me suggest one. Two states for two people. Two states for two people. Actually works really well with drums. Two states for two people, okay? And if you're not doing that, please stay home, okay? Just shut up because all you're doing is making things worse.
You said at the beginning of our conversation you were depressed. Can you give us one scintilla of hope for the future, Tom? Because right now it seems pretty grim in terms of all these things happening at once, that all these building blocks so that we can create peace in the Middle East. Any light for you at all?
Um, Sitting here today, Katie, I can't really see it. There's nothing I can point to you to say this is really, coming. But what I've learned in covering this story is you'll never see it coming. No one saw Anwar Sadat coming. No one saw Oslo coming. The thing that always buoys me is I know Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese, and I know the majority of them do not want to live this way. And I just hope and pray that the logic and energy of that will produce and spark that light.
Tom Friedman, it's always such a privilege to talk to you, Tom. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and with our viewers and our listeners. I'm really grateful.
Can you tell them also, Katie, that I have a new edition of From Beirut to Jerusalem just out, my first book Came out in 1989. I've written a new introduction in light of what happened in the last year. And you can get it at your local bookstore or online retail.
Well, and I can't recommend it highly enough, Tom. And it seems to me, though, it might be time to write a whole new book about what's happening in the Middle East. I guess you can't right now because you won't know how it ends.
Well,
But
yeah, it's
I hope you're thinking about that.
I am writing a new book. It's on something else, but this one, this my book, which was written in 1989 from Beirut to Jerusalem, and this now is a new forward, is depressingly, depressingly still totally relevant because so little has changed. So it's if you're still looking for a guide to the region, pick it up.
All right, Tom, thank you again.
Pleasure, Katie. Thanks so much.